This is Democracy,
a podcast about the people of the United States.
A podcast about citizenship.
About engaging with politics and the world around you.
A podcast about educating yourself on today's important issues
and how to have a voice in what happens next.
Welcome to our new episode of This is Democracy. After a short summer break of a few weeks, we are back. And we're back today to talk about a really important issue, an issue that I think transcends many different parts of the United States and other parts of the world, the challenges of local news coverage. Democracy depends upon citizens having information, good information about what's happening in the world around them, including their local communities. And what the United States and other countries have experienced over the last decade is the rapid decline of local journalism simply because the business model is more difficult. People are not buying local newspapers. They don't want to pay to subscribe to websites that cover local news. Local news coverage on television gets fewer viewers. So much of what happens in our towns and cities and communities is no longer covered by as many journalists as before. Today, we're going to talk to our own Zachary Suri about this topic. Zachary did this last summer working as a local journalist in Milwaukee. He will talk about that, and we'll talk about how he sees local journalism, the challenges it faces, the opportunities, and where we might go from here and how the history of journalism can help us to think about the future. So we've got a lot on the plate, Zachary, huh?
Yes, we do.
It's good to have you back.
Good to be back.
Did you have a good summer, by the way?
I did, yeah. It was
Excellent.
a good time.
Excellent. So maybe let's start by telling our listeners what you did this summer.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing that probably a lot of regular readers of newspapers don't think about very often is what does the life or the daily work of a journalist look like? And part of why I love it, part of why it's so much fun is it looks different every day. You start projects in the morning that you finish in the afternoon, or sometimes you're working on longer term projects, but a lot of the time it means showing up at an event or a press conference and, asking questions and coming back to your office and within an hour writing something about it. Sometimes it means doing investigative work that involves following the paper trail, even historical archival work, sometimes speaking with people who witnessed or experienced things that haven't been covered enough. It's a real mix of important work. But I will say, I think the basic bread and butter of what a journalist does is ask questions. It's why I find it so much fun. Your job is to ask annoying, difficult questions that are hard to answer.
Comes naturally to you.
Yeah, but are critically important. And, the reality is policymakers, even those with the best of intentions, have a lot on their plate. And they're also balancing a lot of real political concerns. And if there isn't someone in the room, even just one person, to ask a difficult question or even just to report on decisions that are often made with little oversight or accountability from the public at late night meetings or early morning press conferences, then those questions often don't get answered at all. And no one knows the answer, which is especially a problem, when something later becomes a real problem down the road. If a decision made 25 years ago, causes a massive financial issue today, and there's nobody 25 years ago who asked difficult questions about that one particular financial decision, then we don't have a record of who to blame at a very basic level.
Right. You're referring to a number of stories you wrote on pension decisions that were made 25 years ago in Milwaukee, pension decisions that continue to affect Milwaukee. We're not going to talk about that story because our listeners can go and read it, actually. All of these stories that might come up in our conversation today are on the website for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. But building on what you just said, Zachary, what is your response to those who have the exact opposite view of the media, which I think we hear more often than what you just said, which is that those in the media, those reporters, they're annoying people who are seeking to find scandals and misinterpret and misconstrue what is going on. And it's a kind of gotcha approach. And many politicians, many business people, many ordinary citizens are skeptical of the need for journalists because they see them as sort of scandal mongers. What's your response to that?
Well, I think the irony of that skepticism is that the primary job of a journalist is to be just that, skeptical. And I think that's part of why journalists often have a reputation for being annoying or asking nitpicky questions. is that, the job of a journalist at some level is to piss everyone off, and to ask,
again, that comes naturally.
ask difficult questions that often, they don't reflect the opinion of the journalist, but they reflect potential answers, potential policy options that haven't been considered or aren't on the table, and they can be difficult for policymakers to answer. I've asked many questions that I wouldn't know how to answer myself if I were in the position of the person I asked, but that's kind of the point. And I think.
But are you asking to embarrass them? Are you asking to expose them? What drives and motivates your questions?
I think at a fundamental level, it's about accountability. It's not about embarrassing anyone. And I think journalists, probably more than any profession besides maybe doctors, think very deeply and spend a lot of time thinking about the ethics of what they do, particularly less so in the case of public figures and politicians, but definitely when that verges on questions about their private lives or their personal affairs. Journalists may not always come to the conclusions that private citizens or those public figures themselves would like. Obviously, the tendency of a journalist and the default is to make information public because our readers expect us to, and that's our duty. But journalists do actually think seriously, if they're doing their job, about the real ethical implications of their work. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to asking policymakers difficult questions that are related to policy, I think that all of us in the public, and I include myself in this because I'm obviously not just a journalist, I'm also a reader of journalism. I rely on journalism. As a citizen, you expect and you want your journalists to ask difficult policy questions, even of people that you might agree with, because even people you agree with can be wrong and make bad decisions that can hurt you. Or they can make really good decisions that no one's giving them credit for. And that's the job of the journalist to report on as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So how does one do this as a local journalist? How do you pick the stories? When people think about local journalism, I think they generally think about sports, right? What are the ways that you learned to do this? And what is the value of not asking questions just of presidents? Everyone sees the value of that. But you spent your summer asking questions of ordinary citizens, of county executives, local judges, et cetera. How does one do that? Why is that important? And how should we understand that?
I think the most important part of local journalism is showing up. I think one would be surprised, someone who doesn't pay close attention to local politics, which for very understandable reasons is most of us, would be surprised how many of the important decisions that really impact your lives, from the roads that you drive on to the schools you send your kids to, are made in late night meetings or meetings in the middle of the workday where there's no one besides the people making the decisions actually in the room. And it is, I think, for obvious reasons, really important that there is someone else in the room, and not just someone else in the room to listen to what's going on, but someone who actually knows all the information that the decision makers have as well, and can ask difficult questions, not to try and come to some politically feasible or politically palatable answer, but to actually get at the truth of what's going on. In some ways, the job of the journalist is to show up to those kinds of meetings, those places where decisions are made with little oversight, and be a voice for truth. But not just a voice for truth, but someone who can keep a record of what actually happens and share that with the public. I think it's actually critical for local democracy. We often talk about the critical elements of American democracy, going back to Alexis de Tocqueville, being participation in local associations, voting, running for local office, all things that Americans participate in ways that are uncommon around the world, even in other democracies today. But a critical part of that has, in the United States, always been a critical press. Mm-hmm. And especially in an era when levels of citizen participation, particularly in local government and local politics, are going down. It's even more important that we have journalists in the room who can tell us what's happening and ask hard questions, and also connect the dots between those policy decisions that often seem very abstract and the real concrete impacts they have on people's lives, even people who don't recognize that the pain that's being caused or the benefit that they're accruing is coming from that decision.
Yeah. Of course, our tradition of a critical press has never really been, with few exceptions, an objective press. historically the press has been biased, right? Most newspapers historically, especially local newspapers, have been owned by one wealthy person or one wealthy corporation or another. And most cities in the early 20th century, for example, had multiple newspapers with multiple points of view. There was a Democratic newspaper, there was a progressive newspaper, there was a Republican newspaper. And so when public figures criticize reporters, they often criticize them for being partisan, especially at the local level, right? There'll be the reporters who are not sympathetic to realtors. And there'll be the reporters who are sympathetic to realtors, right? They might work for different kinds of presses, right? And the other criticism, of course, is that reporters often are young people like you who don't understand what it actually takes to run an organization. How do you respond to those two criticisms, the criticisms of partisanship and the criticisms of ignorance?
Well, I think there's two separate parts to that. There's the criticism that you get from the people that you're actually working with and that you're reporting on. And I think that criticism as a journalist, one has to take seriously and be willing to listen. I think I think there's actually a lot more power in the feeling of being listened to by a journalist than people often realize. I think it often what people are looking for is really for a journalist to hear their point of view and convey that in some way, or even not even convey that, but listen to it and show that they care.
But what if you don't buy their point of view?
And also ask critical questions. I think that the two can go hand in hand. But I don't think the job of a journalist is to be purely objective. Journalism is really boring when it's simply a regurgitation of facts. And particularly in a world of AI, the journalist isn't really adding anything to the equation if you're just reporting minutes from a meeting.
Yeah.
But the purpose of a journalist is to write a story that has an angle, but an angle is different from a thesis. An angle is to say, like, this is the important information, or this is the significance of what happened, which is a very important interpretive act, and one that can only be done successfully when someone brings a lot of knowledge and experience to the table, or at least the hard work and elbow grease that's necessary to come to a legitimate conclusion. And what's important about those kinds of angles is they're not conclusions per se. They're not the end of the story. What makes the job of a journalist special is you're not writing a book on the topic where at the end of the book you have a conclusion chapter. You're writing a story, and you're going to write another story on a very similar topic in the same subject area the next day or the next week, and it might take a completely different angle. And so I think the most important thing for a journalist to be is not try and pretend that they can be fully objective and never interpret anything, but simply regurgitate facts. Instead, a journalist has to be willing to constantly change their mind and look at things from different points of view, and also to be skeptical of everyone and everything and ask difficult questions of everyone. Yeah. What I would be concerned by is if only politicians of a certain party or a certain race or a certain gender or a certain policy position are getting difficult questions in your community or are having their finances or their personal lives investigated. I think that the answer, though, is not that those people shouldn't be investigated, but that the journalist is failing to investigate everyone else.
Right. So it's in a sense, everyone should be fair game to the same difficult questions. The potential sexual scandals of one group should not insulate another group from being investigated for those, right?
Precisely. And also there's a distinction here between public figures and private citizens. Again, journalists think very, very seriously about these ethical questions, particularly when it comes to private citizens, to minors, to people who are in vulnerable positions in our community. And so I don't think that what I'm saying doesn't apply to everyone across the board, but to public figures, yes.
So much of what you just said is that, you have an angle, but you follow the facts. That makes a lot of sense. And you have to be willing to change your mind. That's good.
Even while writing the article, the angle isn't something that you might have a sense of what it's going to be, but you really have to report the story first.
The angle probably changes as you follow the evidence, right?
Certainly. And it has to be completely grounded in fact.
So how do you assess facts? This is, I think, what a lot of people don't really understand, especially for local journalism. How did you, as a local journalist in Milwaukee this last couple of months, how did you check the factual veracity of stories when you heard rumors or people, even powerful people, told you things? How does one check facts? How do you know a fact is a fact? This is something that is obviously a big debate in our society now.
Well, I think, and a lot of it comes down to something that is actually a very human process, which I don't think AI will ever be able to replicate, which is the process of assessing the truth value of statements. And it involves judgment calls. It's not like a machine that you can put something in and know for certain that you're getting the right answer out of it. But at the same time, a lot of it is about transparency. It's about following the receipts and showing your reader the receipts as well. And as a reporter, I think our job is to do that whenever possible. Now, there are some cases in some stories where, for very important ethical reasons, you can't show all your receipts. And that's part of why it's important for the journalist to show all of their receipts when they can, so that someone can trust that they've actually gone through the right process on this article because they've done it before and they know the facts and they know who they're talking to. But a lot of it also comes down to building trust with the reader. And it's an art, not a science. Sometimes journalists get things wrong. Sometimes I spell a name wrong and it gets printed in the newspaper, and that's embarrassing and
but then you correct it.
Not fun. And then you correct it, and you're transparent about the correction that you're making and the change that you're having to make. And again, you're writing the first draft of history. You're not writing the history book.
Mm-hmm.
So you can write the second draft a different way, or to display a different point of view. What I always say if someone tells me, you're missing something, or even you got this fact wrong, usually, obviously every time I check and double check my receipts, most of the time, it's not that I got the fact wrong. It's that they didn't like the fact that I printed. But if I'm missing something, or if there's a blind part, what's the term I'm looking for? Like a blind spot in my article, then I simply say, the next article will perhaps include that, or look at it that way. And
so it's an evolving process.
Right. But also, journalism is one of those jobs. It's like being a politician in this way, where you can't please everyone. And the goal is not to please your reader every time, or even, to build trust with every single person who could possibly be reading the newspaper, but to build trust and a sense of reliability and honesty and equal opportunity skepticism among the people that you work with as sources, the people you question, and the people who read you. It's a kind of a bridge between the two.
Right. And part of that then is having an audience. How do you reach an audience, a local audience now? We know what websites and even national newspapers do to get an audience. They create national sensational stories, right? That drives clickbait. It drives traffic. Local stories often aren't as sexy, and certainly the local reporting you're talking about is not about one sex scandal after another, though that might be reported every now and then. What you did and what your colleagues at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel did this summer that I read was bread and butter reporting on transportation and budgets and things of that sort. How do you get people to be interested in that? It doesn't have an effect unless you have readers, right? So how do you get people to read that?
I think part of that's one of the hardest things to do as a journalist, is it's actually the easier part, particularly if you're someone who enjoys or finds politics fascinating, as I do, is getting the facts sometimes. Oftentimes, the hardest part is actually explaining them in a way that makes people care, or that's even understandable. And so I think that's really why a journalist is important, because even the politicians, even the most competent politicians, the ones who really understand the policy and the budgeting and the finance, are often the ones who are the worst at explaining it to people. And so even in the case where you have, perfect savant leadership, you need a journalist to explain what they're actually doing. And I think a lot of it comes down to focusing on human stories and showing people how policy decisions matter in their lives. It's something politicians are, particularly at a local level, sometimes aren't good at, which is saying, this fiscal decision or this budgeting decision I made 10 years ago has impacted your life in XYZ way. And it's hard as a journalist sometimes to find the time or the space to do that. But I think those are often the stories that get the most interest, is when people can see a connection between either big political events nationally and their lives in their neighborhood, or small local decisions that nobody even knew about and their lives in their neighborhood. And also, in some ways at a local level, it's actually easier to do this. I mean, there was a Pulitzer Prize winning story by the Connecticut Mirror last year about how cars in Connecticut were getting towed and impounded within 15 days. And there were a lot of predatory towing companies that were making a lot of money off of this. And that immediately got a lot of attention. And it ended up changing state law in a matter of months, because everyone who drives a car in the entire state, this is relevant for them. I mean, if you've ever gotten a parking ticket or ever gotten your car towed, this is clearly a relevant story. And that's not the kind of thing that's, sexy or that gets a lot of clicks online unless you live in that jurisdiction that affects you in your daily life. So I think it's just important for journalists to show the human side of these political stories and these political fights, and not get too caught up in the sort of drama of politics, which can be fun and interesting too, but it often doesn't have the same appeal to people who are, busy or trying to make ends meet.
That makes a lot of sense. Can you give us an example from one of the stories you published of how you did this?
Yeah, I mean, one of the stories, we mentioned it earlier, the story about the Milwaukee County pension scandal of 2001. Very complicated story about poor fiscal decision-making 25 years ago, before I was even born, in Milwaukee County, and how it had impacted county services, investment in parks, the bus system, pools, etc. And I talked to a lot of experts, policymakers, people who were there at the time, the former governor, about these issues. But I also realized that nobody who was living in Milwaukee today, who wasn't a journalist or involved in politics, really knew about the scandal period, cared about it, would read the story.
25 years ago, right?
So what I did is I spent a few days going around to random bus stops in town and pools and parks, and just talking to people, not about this pension scandal, because I wasn't going to, explain to them, in person exactly the complicated financial mechanisms. But I was trying to understand is how the services from the county that they relied on had changed over the years, and how that had affected their lives. And those are the kinds of questions that people don't always expect from a journalist, but are often the most willing to answer. How does the bus routes changing affect you? How does the rise in bus fare affect you? What does it mean for your family that the pool you used to swim at has been closed for 7 years?
So how did you do that? I imagine you, and I know we talked about it at the time, you're going to a bus stop, and there are people getting on the bus who are very different from you. They look different. They have different life histories than yours. How did you approach them? How did you get them to talk to you openly and honestly about these issues?
Well, I mean, a lot of it is just being willing to bang your head against the wall enough times. There are a lot of people who aren't willing to talk to you. A lot of people who don't have interesting things to say, don't understand the questions. It's important to always be listening to people, even if a conversation starts out that way, because you never know what direction it's going to go in. And it's also important just to be gathering information, not just from the people who say the thing you're looking to hear, but the things that you might not be looking to hear. I heard from a lot of people who were very happy with the bus system in Milwaukee. That wasn't what I was expecting to hear. But it became a small part of the story that there weren't just people who were upset about it, because that's, part of the information that I found. So you can't come in just looking for the one person, selecting the person who fits your narrative or the narrative you're looking to tell. So instead, I think what it is just sort of being willing to listen to people and ask them questions that feel relevant to their lives.
But how did you get them to open up to you? Because one of the hard parts in our society now is the lack of trust with journalists, academics, anyone who's outside of your area. People are just, they're concerned that maybe you work for ICE or maybe something else. So how did you get people to open up?
I mean, I think the answer is ask questions that are relevant to their lives. I didn't ask them, what do you think of the county executive, or how should the county spend its money, or who's your county board supervisor, political questions that matter to me as a political journalist, but don't have immediate saliency in someone's life. But you ask them questions like, how often do you use this park? What does this park mean to you and your family? Questions that doesn't take brilliance to come up with, but are actually questions that people have real answers to and often have thought about or have feelings about. A lot of the job of a journalist isn't to ask the most brilliant question that puts someone off their feet, but to ask a question that gets at what someone actually feels.
Right. It's not a seminar room or a courtroom.
Yeah.
You actually have to meet people where they are and get them to open up. Yes.
Yeah. And there's a danger in viewing every conversation as a kind of cross-examination. You have to be willing to have a human conversation too.
Yeah. Yeah. What are the limits of local journalism? What did you run up against that frustrated you?
Well, I mean, I think there are obviously a lot of limits to our current local media landscape. Certain places get covered way better than others. Certainly if you live in Milwaukee, you have better local journalism than if you live, in the middle of nowhere in northern Wisconsin. There are people doing great work up there, but there's just more to cover, more area, more governments to cover. I think also, it's become easier and easier for politicians and policymakers who don't want to talk to the press to not talk to the press, particularly with social media. People don't rely on the press in the same way or to the same degree as they used to for information from their politicians and policymakers. If you can go on social media and hear what Zoran Mamdani has to say about XYZ policy, you're not necessarily going to read in the newspaper about it. And so that changes how politicians look at the media and their relationship with the media. And I think also just financial changes and the changing business model has made it harder for a lot of newspapers to justify or find the resources for the kind of human stories we're talking about, the kind of stories that bridge policy in people's lives. And oftentimes there's a tendency to want to focus either on the sort of gotcha investigations, which are really important, and also play an important role in holding politicians accountable, or the just basic going through the motions, day-to-day coverage. And so there's less energy, less personnel, fewer resources for that kind of coverage. Thankfully, not at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, but at a lot of other publications, there isn't really the space or the attention to do that kind of work. And I think it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Fewer people have subscribed to newspapers, so newspapers have less money to do the kind of work that really matters to people, and so fewer people subscribe to newspapers.
Right. What about the role of press secretaries, press handlers of one kind or another? First of all, politicians didn't have them in the same numbers a half a century ago that they do today. And there used to be, at least at the national level, a presumption that the press secretary would always give you the perspective from the boss, but could not lie, right? There was an ethic around that. That's obviously something that's been broken recently. It doesn't mean they never lied, but there was a presumption of truthfulness in what they did, which I don't think is there today. And as you said, many powerful figures, they don't just have to be politicians. They can be business leaders. They now speak to their audience by going around the press. So how did you navigate that? How did you navigate press secretaries, press handlers, people whose job it is to spin you when you're doing your reporting at the local level?
Well, I think there's two ways to handle that. The first is maybe it's a good thing, that people have more combative relationships with press secretaries and others, because we should be checking the facts always, even if it's someone we trust, even if it's someone we work with regularly. Part of the job of a journalist is just to do that basic due diligence that nobody else has time to do.
Right, but it's not just about checking facts. Sometimes they say things, and this happens for all kinds of people, we're not picking on anyone, that are just patently false, but they still expect you to print them because they've said what they've said.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the power and the fun of being a journalist is you don't just get to, you have to look into whether something is true or not. And, you might end up printing that lie, but you're also going to print, this is not true for XYZ reason, or the proof that it's not true as well. So part of the job of journalists is just to call out people on their BS. To get at the deeper part of the question, though, about, how do you work with people who don't need you in the same way they used to? I think it's a challenge. Part of it is showing your willingness to listen. I mean, again, the most powerful thing a journalist has is their time and their willingness to listen to someone, even someone who's trying to spin them, can actually make a really big difference and make it easier for that person to see them as someone they can work with. And also the truth is journalists actually, even today, particularly when you're working on a story that, isn't simply positive about a particular person or a particular policymaker, journalists need the press people the press people to listen to them a lot less than the press people need the journalists to listen to them. Journalists can always report around a difficult source or someone who isn't giving them the information they need, and find that information elsewhere. Whereas a politician or a policymaker who wants to get their perspective across in the context of a particular issue doesn't have as many options.
Yeah, this is a really good point. We live in an information-rich environment, which allows principals to get around the journalists, but it means journalists can get the information without the principals also, without
right.
the key figures. I think anyone listening to you, Zachary, the content and also the enthusiastic tone of your descriptions can get a sense of how much fun this is, how exciting.
It's very fun.
This was not a summer making coffee for other people. This was a summer really learning and exposing and understanding and providing education to the public through your journalism. Is it common, and is it possible for other young people, particularly young people who are listening to us now, to do this kind of work as young people?
Well, I mean, I think one of the amazing things about journalism as an industry is it's so product dependent. I mean, there's a lot of networks and plenty of problems that it's not just merit based, obviously, but it is one of the few professions where like you really are judged by your product in so many ways. And I think the most important thing to remember is that you can do really good work anywhere. And sometimes the most interesting work is to be done is in places where that work hasn't been done in far too long. And I think one of the challenges with journalism is there's a perception that it's sort of not a lucrative career. There's not place for advancement. And certainly all those concerns are grounded in real problems and things that affect journalists. And you don't want to discount that. But at the same time, journalism is also one of those fields where if you do good work, it gets recognized. Your product matters. And you can learn on the job too. All you need to do is find someone crazy enough to trust you to do one thing. And if you do it well, they'll trust you to do another thing.
You can also freelance, right? You can find a story, a local story that you think is important, that you think others will want to read about. And even if no one initially sees that, you can write that story and then try to sell it to an appropriate publication. Am I correct?
Yeah, there are plenty of journalists today who make a living or at least have a following and have readers, writing on Substack or even on social media. They're not always the most reliable, but sometimes they are actually the most reliable information, particularly in a small local community without a major newspaper. And you never know who's reading. I think that's one of the fun things too is, you write as a journalist, unlike, when you're doing communications work or when you're doing, other kinds of jobs that involve a lot of writing, you're writing to be read by as many people as possible. Yeah. And not just people of a particular point of view, but people across the board. And you'd be surprised what stories get the most attention and what stories don't. And I think part of the fun of being a journalist is reacting to that in real time and having obviously a real sense of purpose and duty and what people should be reading, but also reacting to what people want to read as well.
Yeah. So this is something you're considering doing as a career, yes?
Yes.
What do you say, and it builds on the prior comment, what do you say to people who say, well, the world of journalism is a failed business and there's no future here. You're not going to make money doing this. We have friends who've said this to you. What do you say to that?
Well, I think, particularly in a world with such fast changing technology, the ability to assess the truth value of something, and not just that, but to collect information from real people in real time. You can call it data, you can call it, stories, whatever you want to call it. It's so vital and it's only becoming more valuable. I mean, an AI model might be able to write a fairly decent story about, what happened in Congress yesterday if you feed it the C-SPAN feed. And it might even be better than what, early career journalists can write about that. But it's not going to be able to go out on the street and talk to people at bus stops and ask them human questions and show them that they're listening and paying attention to what they have to say. And it's certainly not going to be able to, ask a politician a difficult question in real time. So I think those skills are becoming more and more valuable, not just because there's more need for them in a world with more misinformation, but also because the new technologies that we're using and that we're building rely on human inputs that have to be, built, strung together by real human beings who understand the topic that they're covering, the community that they're covering, and also how to tell a good story.
Right. And make sense of it all.
Yeah.
So our final question, it's a two-part question. I hope our listeners are enthusiastic, even more enthusiastic about high-quality local journalism and a new generation of Zacharys writing it. How can those who want to become journalists like you, how can they get started? And how can those who want to support local journalism, how can they support it?
I would say, first of all, write about what you're passionate about, whether it's, high school sports or, climate and the environment or local politics like me. And, you just have to start somewhere and you have to do good work. So if you're a student, write for your student paper. Maybe your student paper has never sent someone to the city council or the board of education. Doesn't mean they can't send them tomorrow. If you're not a student, first of all, read good journalism. reach out to journalists. Journalists are always happy to talk about their work, and start writing yourself and showing up at places and learning about things. A lot of the basic skills of a journalist are the basic skills of a good citizen as well. And you can participate in this process and support journalism and be a part of good journalism in your community without being a journalist or changing your career or doing X, Y, Z. And sometimes it requires money. Oftentimes it doesn't. And it just requires your time.
Yeah. It's often said that journalism is the first draft of history. I think that underrates the importance of journalism. I think journalism is often the foundation for democracy and history. And you've given us so much reason in this conversation, Zachary, to be optimistic about the future of democracy through the work of young journalists working at the local level. Start local, get involved, ask real questions, write about it, share information with people. That's what our founders did. That's how our republic was started, and that's how our republic will survive. Zachary, thank you for your insights and your passion and sharing it with us today. Maybe you'll write a poem about this at some point for us.
Probably not.
Thank you most of all to our loyal listeners. We hope you all had a wonderful summer. We are now back to our regular cadence. Thank you to all of our listeners who listen to us each week, who subscribe to our Substack, and join us for this and other episodes of This Is Democracy.
This podcast is produced by the Liberal Arts ITS Development Studio
and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin.
The music in this episode was written and recorded by Scott Holmes.
Stay tuned for a new episode every week.
You can find This Is Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube.
See you next time.